Hello, I'm Deborah from the Chicago MBDA Export Center, and today we are bringing you training on grant writing. We have Suzanne, and she is an expert in the field with lots of experience. And what we do at the Chicago MBDA Export Center, we are one of the programs under Chicago MSDC, and our objective is to help minority businesses grow and scale outside of the U.S. with a focus on Africa. And so, Suzanne, you can unmute yourself and we will get started. And
Great.
all questions, I'm sorry, one more thing. You put all your questions in the chat. That's how we will answer the questions. So go right ahead, Suzanne. And Kevin, you can go ahead and turn off your camera. You don't need your camera.
All right, so we'll just jump into it. Hi, everybody. My name is Suzanne Alden, and I'm a grant writer and trainer and consultant. And I am so excited to be here and delivering this training. We are going to talk about all things grants for the next hour and a half. And you're going to learn a lot. It's going to be a lot. Don't worry about taking extensive notes. The PowerPoint is available to whomever wants it. And it's a lot of stuff in there. It's power packed. So we are just going to jump right in. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And I will shut off my camera. Great. Does that look good? You can see that? Grant Writing Basics for Business?
Yes, it looks good.
All right, great. So just a quick note before we get started. I'm going to give a sort of an overview, and we're going to take a brief pause in case there are any questions, and then we will get into the second part of the training. And towards the end, we will be looking at an actual request for proposals, and I'll be pointing out some things to look for and ways for you to get started on your grant writing. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A. So there will be time for questions, and my email address is right there. In case you need to reach out. I encourage people to reach out if you'd like. All right, so let's just jump right in. Grant Writing Basics for Business. What we are going to cover today, we are going to talk first about finding funding opportunities for your for-profit entities with some pointers to nonprofit sources. And I know that the focus here is on for-profit, which is great. A couple of times I'll throw in a few unique aspects of nonprofit grant writing in case some of you are also considering a nonprofit sort of side enterprise. How to write compelling proposals. We'll talk about the ins and the outs of all of the common components to grant proposals. Here you go, right there. And we'll talk about budgeting just a little bit. We're not going to get too much into the numbers, but I want to give you a little flavor of what budgets are all about. And then, like I said, we'll review an actual RFP, and an RFP is a request for proposal. And we'll go over that, and I'll point out some things to be aware of. All right, so getting started with grant writing. So what is a grant proposal? This sounds pretty basic, but I'd like to go through a couple of things so that you can begin understanding what funders are looking for in their proposals and what they might be thinking about. So first of all, grant proposals. They are the way to get funds for your programs, for operating costs, capital projects, which is money to build something or buy something big, money for business startups, and for entrepreneurship, all different types of things. Now, charitable and many business funders, there are certain things that they won't give money for. Generally, there are exceptions, but in general, they typically won't fund lobbying of any politicians, any legislators, political campaigns. They typically don't give money for that, or faith-based work, and there are some exceptions there. So if you're thinking about doing any of those activities, you really want to keep your eyes peeled because most funders will not give money for those activities. So we are seeking money from a lot of different entities, government sources, which could be local, state, or federal, foundations, corporations, and local organizations. So many different types of groups give funding, and each of these sources has their own interests. They have their own requirements, they have their own concerns, and we'll go over some of those throughout the presentation. Now, ultimately, your grant proposal, what you're really aiming to do here is you want it to be compelling and you want it to be convincing and address the needs and the desires of the entity making the grant. And if you had this paperwork in front of you, this presentation in front of you, and you had to highlight anything in this whole presentation, this statement would be the one that you would want to highlight and remember. Because oftentimes when we talk about what we do, we're so excited about our business. We're so excited about our project. And we see it from the inside because it's our baby, right? But remember that funders have their own interests. They want to give money for very specific reasons. It may be different from your reasons. And so as you're going about researching and writing and all of that, you always want to have in the back of your mind, what is this particular funder looking for? And how can I craft my proposal to meet their needs and to convince them that I am the type of business that they want to fund? So it's not so in other words, it's not all about you. Grant proposals are very often about the funder and what they're looking to accomplish. So the typical grants process, and there's some variation here, but generally this is how it works. The first step that you would take would be conducting research and seeking out notifications that grant money is available to you. Now, sometimes you may become aware of a prospective funding opportunity for you. Other times you have to be proactive and go out there and find them. They're not always going to come to you. So knowing how to research funders is a really important skill. So once you've found a funder that you think might be interested in your business, there's a couple of things that you really want to look for right off the bat, because we are all busy people. Nobody wants to be researching for hours upon hours a day. And so the first thing that you want to know about any funding opportunity, first of all, you're checking to make sure that you are eligible. And this might sound like a no-brainer, but I can't tell you how many times I've been involved in projects where grants have come back with a negative outcome, right? Proposals have been rejected because the organization did not closely read the eligibility requirements. They're not actually eligible to receive the grant. So they went through all that process of writing and all that expense only to find they were never eligible in the first place. So you want to check the eligibility. You want to review all of the terms and conditions. Now, the terms and conditions also really important, because sometimes a funder will have, like in the fine print, they will have you agree to do certain things or to give them certain things, and you may not want to do that or be able to do that. So for example, say that the funder, a government funder, and sometimes this happens with government agencies, they want to be able to take any patents that are developed or any intellectual property that's developed as the result of their funding your project. Now, you may not want to give that up. And so reading those terms and conditions for things like that, really important, because you don't want to get an award only to find, oh no, now I have to do something that I'm just not prepared to do. And you want to read the guidelines and the rest of all the requirements, the deadlines, all the different parts of the proposal that you have to write. You want to sort of scope all that out. Now, sometimes, and this is a wonderful thing, a funder will say, we don't want a whole proposal for you. We don't want a 20-page proposal. We would just like to get from you what's called a letter of intent, and that's called an LOI. Letter of intent, letter of interest, there's different things that they call it. But basically, it's like an elevator speech, a written elevator speech. It's usually like a 1, 2, or 3-page document that just tells the quick and the dirty of your business and what you're looking to have funded. And this is great because this saves you time, right? You don't have to spend time doing all the writing. And it saves the funder time because now they don't have to read all your writing. If you are encouraged to submit a proposal, This is like the meat and the potatoes of your grant writing. You're going to make your draft, you're going to review it, you're going to edit it and submit it. And that is really where the bulk of your time will be spent. And we'll talk more in the presentation about what all those steps are. Then the grant maker conducts their review. Sometimes it's one person reading proposals and making decisions. Sometimes it's a committee of people. Sometimes they have experts review proposals depending on how difficult or how much expertise is required to review these proposals. So one thing to think about is who is going to be reading my proposal? And sometimes you'll know this and sometimes you won't. But it's great if you do know, because then you can make sure that you are writing your proposal to speak to that particular individual and their knowledge base and what they might care about. If you are lucky enough to get the grant, then they issue what's called an award. And at that time, there'll be some negotiations. Sometimes you'll get the check, you'll get the money, but also you'll be told what sort of reports you have to file. And sometimes organizations and businesses fall through here because they forget. So it's a really good thing to look in that letter or whatever you receive that says, hey, you got the grant, and remember and write down on a calendar when reports are due. Because sometimes it's very important, because if you want to go back to that same funder down the road and you didn't file your report from the last grant, sometimes that will rule you out. Okay, so finding grant opportunities, how you do it. You want to avoid using Google extensively. Google can get you to certain lists and websites that will be helpful for finding grant opportunities, but really try to maximize your time by using services that are set up to do just this. So for example, say you are looking for a charitable grant, also called private grants. There are two databases that are available for a subscription cost. One of them is Foundation Directory Online, and the other is GrantsWatch. And those are great because it's like a big database of hundreds of thousands of funders, and you can enter in terms, you can enter in your subject area, your business area, where your business is located, and you can sort of hone in on the funders that are most likely to be interested in funding you. So those are well worth the money. You can pay for a month subscription, do all your research, and then cancel it. So it's a really good thing to check out. So say you are interested in local or state funding opportunities. Those are sometimes a little more difficult to find. You really have to know your location. Sometimes for local grants, the city website or the town website will post grant opportunities. You can check those out. Sometimes the state, whichever state you're in, they have an area on their website for public bidding. Sometimes it's called purchasing, where they'll put out notifications and saying, you know, we have this money, we want to fund this. And from there, you can get more information on how to apply. If you're looking for federal grants, and these are grants from some of the bigger agencies, such as the Department of Education or National Science Foundation, there are a lot of them. The best place to go to seek them out is grants.gov. And they too have a huge list, and it's searchable, of all the federal grant opportunities that are out there for any given time. Now there's also websites and listservs. And I've seen quite a few of these for the business community, not so common for the nonprofit world. I think it's because business grants are sometimes a little more difficult to find. So there are websites and listservs that have lists of grant opportunities for businesses. And so that is where Google comes in. And if you Google around and use a couple of these terms, such as you see in this presentation, you will come across some of those, and you can sign up for regular updates to be notified when there's a new grant opportunity. And that'll be helpful. That's just another way to get access to grants. And so sort of the overarching theme here is you don't really want to rely on one source. You want to look through all of these potential sources so that you're covering the whole possible ground of grants. Okay, so you found a funder and now you want to look at the grant opportunity, see if it's right for you. Now, an RFP is what is a request for proposal. They call it an RFP. So if you hear me use that term, that's what that means. All right, first question, I mentioned this earlier. Am I eligible? Make sure that you're eligible. That's the first thing you want to look for. Can I meet the terms and conditions? And we talked about that and why that's important too. Are there any concerns with intellectual property or rights? Say the funder would be funding the development of a product or a service. Are there any concerns with who owns that product and service? And that will always be disclosed in the RFP. Do I have to register? So sometimes with government grants, they require you to register in a system. It could be a grants portal. It could be a system known as SAMS on the federal government, which is basically you just get set up in their system to receive grants. That's always something to look at early on because sometimes that registration process can take a while. Is my project or business or program a good fit? Now, sometimes I've seen novice, grant writers and nonprofits and businesses look through an RFP and try to convince themselves that this is the one for them. And sometimes we have to do a reality check. If you're reading the RFP and they're saying that they want to fund certain types of work or products or whatever, that it's really not you, then that's when you want to close the book on that opportunity. You don't want to try to take your work and fit it in with a funder's interests if you really don't fit. And the reason for that is you could try to convince them that you are the right entity to receive that grant, but when the money comes in, then you have to execute. And if you find yourself agreeing to do something that's really not what you're typically doing or not something that you have the ability to follow through on, it's the worst thing to get a grant award and then to have to give it back and say, you know what, I really can't execute this. So ask yourself honestly, is my project a good fit for what they're looking for? Do I have the time? Now, most of the time we say no because we're busy people. But realistically, if you're looking at that RFP and if they've got 50 questions for you to answer and you're concerned, like, I'm not sure I could do this, that might be a no. That might be a reason to pass on this opportunity. And can I properly use the funds? Now, sometimes you'll get money that will just be given to you as a result of your proposal. And then the funder walks away and says, good luck, enjoy, right? But sometimes funders want reports and they want to know what you're doing with their money. And so it's very, very important to ask yourself, can I actually use the money for what I say I'm going to be doing? Now, that might seem like a no-brainer, but sometimes it's not. And I have seen quite a few cases where organizations have had to turn back money. They can't use the funds in the way that the funder wants them to. So there's a lot of questions to ask yourself. Let's talk for a minute about why proposals are denied. And so knowing why proposals are not funded is a really good thing to do. So you can know, okay, these are things that I don't want to do. These are things I want to avoid, right? So sometimes proposals are denied because there's no program alignment with the funder's goals. So, and I've reviewed grant proposals before, and sometimes I've read them and said, wait a minute, like this person is asking for something that we are not funding. Clearly we're not funding. And then that goes out into the wastebasket, right? No program alignment with the funder's goals. That's a big, big reason. Sometimes the applicant is located in a geographic area that the funder is not providing money for. And many, many funders, not so much in the business community, mostly in the nonprofit community, they're very focused on a particular location. It could be a town, it could be a state, it could be the country, it could be around the world. And so if you're not really located in the right area, sometimes your proposal will get the axe. So that's something that you want to investigate to make sure, yes, they are funding businesses that are located where I'm at. This is a biggie, and this is one that is totally under your control. So sometimes we can't control why our proposals are denied. Sometimes they're just denied, right? We could have a perfect proposal, did everything right, and it could still be denied. But if your application is poorly written, that is totally within your ability to fix, right? So it's great. It's a good thing because you know that if your application is written well, that you will have an edge. And I mentioned a moment ago that I've been on review committees, and I have to tell you, I would say probably 25 to 30% of the proposals I've reviewed were really poorly written, poor grammar, mistakes, just the formatting was really weird. And it doesn't really convey that the applicant is on top of things, that they are concerned about sending in a polished proposal. How does that reflect on you as the applicant? So you want to take the time you need to make sure that that application is edited and it's in the right, using the right terminology, and that it's formatted well. Okay, sometimes proposals are denied because the project is really not realistic or it's not well designed. And we have big dreams, we have big goals for our businesses. But sometimes funders may look at our idea and say, well, it really doesn't look like it's feasible. I don't think their business plan really makes sense. Or I think that they need more time as a company to develop before I'm willing to sink some investment into them. So sometimes they will look at your proposal in this light. This isn't something you can really control. You are who you are. You want to represent where your business is at any given point. But just be aware that sometimes they may look at you and say, well, you know, your business is too young. You haven't had a chance to really get established. And so I'm gonna pass on your proposal. Your budget doesn't adhere to good spending practices. And this is, or government rules. And this is really important anytime that you're writing a government grant. They almost always want you to follow certain rules. And in the RFP, there'll be some pointer to what these rules are. So, so if you do notice that in the RFP, they say we want to make sure that you are spending money in adherence with, you know, government regulations, you want to look at that and you want to make sure that you are proposing to use the funds in alignment with those rules and regulations. So sometimes a proposal will be not denied because of the budget. You have a poor reputation in the community. This is one that I don't see come up all that much, but sometimes if there has been bad press about your organization or your business, that can come back to bite you. Again, you can only control what you can control, but be aware that if you do have a reputation that's a little sketchy, sometimes funders will know about it. And sometimes they'll Google you and they'll just get more information about your business or you as the person who has founded or is running the business. Okay, so tips as you get started. And these, again, if you're going to highlight anything in this presentation, these tips are all really, really crucial. Research who else has received this grant or award. The recipients of recent grants for any funder is a great indication of who they're going to fund next year, right? So if you're not really sure if this particular funding opportunity is right for you, try to find out who else in the past has received those awards, has received those grants, and see if those businesses look like yours. If those businesses are radically different, that probably means that the funder is not really going to want to fund in your direction, that they're looking to fund something else. So look at prior grantees, and those people are called, those organizations are called grantees. Another tip is to speak in the right language. And I don't mean language as in English, Spanish, French. I mean, think about your funder, think about what area and what realm they're in, and who might be reading your proposal, who might be deciding on your proposal. You want to speak in the right language with them, right? And sometimes we get caught up in sounding super professional. We want to use really formal language and language that gives the indication that we're very advanced and very knowledgeable. A lot of times, the people who are reading proposals, they would rather just read your proposal as if you're standing right there in front of them talking off the cuff. But it's good to know who's reading your proposal so that you can use the right terminology and really be speaking directly to them. In any proposal, you always want to be sure to state how you meet the criteria for funding. And sometimes the funder will ask you to answer certain questions to make sure you're eligible. And sometimes they won't. But it's always good to let them know in your proposal, I meet your criteria. And that could just be a sentence or that could be a paragraph. It really depends on the RFP and what they're looking for you to write about. But always be thinking about that. I want to make sure that they know that I meet their criteria. Aligning your project to a funder's mission. And I alluded to this in the beginning, that when you write grants, it's not all about you. It's all about the funder. What is their mission? What are they trying to accomplish through their grant making? When you know that, then you can appeal to that mission. And you can give the sense in your grants that, hey, I know you care about this, and guess what? So do I. And therefore, I am a good prospect for you to fund. So really aligning what you care about with what they care about is definitely a winning strategy. Whenever you can, include some form of collaboration in your project or your proposal. Now, sometimes it doesn't work. It's not feasible. We don't want to just find collaborators just to have a good grant proposal, but it's really great when you're working with other people or other groups, and funders like to see collaboration. So keep your eyes peeled and your mind open to ways that you can partner with others. And this is a biggie. Again, this is totally under your control. Make sure you submit everything requested. And sometimes we're doing things at the last minute. We're right up against a deadline and you're rushing to get it in, and you leave out a copy of your business license, or you leave out a list of your board of directors, or a list of folks that have invested in your business. If that's required, you need to submit that. And sometimes funders will say, oh, they forgot this attachment. Nope. And they won't even consider you for a grant. So check and double check. Make sure that you're submitting everything that's requested. Have an editor review your work. Now, some of us are good writers and some of us know our limitations and know we are not good writers. So that doesn't mean that you can't grant write, but it's a great idea to have somebody. It could be somebody in your family, a friend, a business colleague, anybody who's willing to just take a look, eyeball your proposal, and ask for their honest feedback. Sometimes it hurts. I'll tell you, when I first started grant writing, my first few proposals I sent out, and they were not that great. And I asked people for feedback, and they said, "Oh, this was awful, and you really should have proved it." And it hurts because we all have egos, right? We want to know that what we're doing is really good quality, but let's keep our mind and our heart open to what other people have to suggest, because ultimately, you want to be successful. And if that means that someone is going to say your proposal is poorly written and you got to start over, that's what you got to do. So have somebody look over your work and give you feedback. And finally, don't shoot too high. So if you're looking at an RFP and this funder is offering up to $500,000 for a project that's way outside of your scope, and you're looking at this and you're saying, oh my gosh, that is a lot of money. I could really use that money. But does it require more infrastructure than you actually have? Does it require more employees, more staff than you have? You don't want to commit to something you don't think you're going to be able to follow through on. So be realistic. Don't shoot for a project that's, huge and something that you don't know if you can actually pull off. Okay, so this might be a good time to pause for a moment or two and see if there's any questions. I know I covered a lot. I did a lot of talking. Is there anything that folks would like to know about.
All right, so if you have any questions, put them in the chat. Currently, I don't see any questions in the thing. People are just asking about the recording. So as of right now, yeah, we don't have anything, so.
Okay, so should I just launch right in?
Yes, go ahead, and then we'll, at the next point, where your next break is, we have questions, we can take them there.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Okay, so for the second part of the presentation, I'm just going to keep my mind and my eye on the time here. We are going to talk about common grant components. Now, every application is going to look different. I wish they were all the same, but they're not. And oftentimes you might write an application to funder A, and you might be hoping, oh, I'd love to send the same application to like 10 other organizations, and find that for your next 10 grants, they want something totally different each time. But so that's probably what's going to happen to you. But there are some very common grant components. And so we're going to cover those. And I'm just going to give you a little insight as to what they're about and how you might want to craft them. So oftentimes your proposal will have to start with what's called a summary or an abstract or an introduction. And this is like your quick elevator speech. Sometimes a funder will ask for it, sometimes not. And before I go any further in this presentation, let me just say that we want to do what they tell us to do. So this wouldn't be the time to get super creative. If a funder says, don't submit a summary or an abstract, we don't want to submit it, right? So always make sure that what you're writing about is something that's actually required. So sometimes a funder wants a summary, sometimes it's not important to them. And your summary will contain a very brief overview of the main points of your proposal. So tip, I always write this last. I never start by writing a summary, because sometimes you'll get started in your proposal, and then when you wind up at the end, it could look a little different than you envisioned in the beginning. So write your proposal first, and then take the main points and craft your summary. Now, in your summary, it would also be really helpful to address a problem or a situation that you are going to be required to solve. Now, not every grant proposal is going to be grounded in a problem to be solved, but very often funders will say, we want to solve this social problem. We want to solve this economic problem. We want you to explain to us how you are going to address it. That is something very important to put in the summary, because again, what is the funder thinking about as they're reading your proposal? They want their problem solved, and you want to let them know right off the bat that you are the entity to solve it. Now, this is a business grant, which you all are business writers. Make the case that you are compelling and a good investment, because ultimately the funder is making an investment in you and your ideas, your products, and your services. So this is where you brag, and grant proposals are a bit like bragging. You're talking about all the great aspects of what you do and who you are and your history. So when you're writing your summary and abstract, try to put a couple things in there to let them know you are a good investment, that you are, you have a good history, that you are trustworthy, that you follow through on all of your commitments. That's something to be thinking about. Now, if you read this piece standalone, it's the only thing that somebody read in your proposal, it really should be able to speak for itself, right? And sometimes funders will only read summaries. They'll just do a quick, they'll look it over, and they'll make their decision right now if they're going to read any more. So that summary, really, you want it to be well done and address all of the things here on the screen. Okay, so now we're starting to get into the nuts and the bolts of the proposal. Very often you'll be asked to write about your history or your business purpose or milestones or groundbreaking achievements that you have made. And again, this is where you're bragging and you're really showcasing yourself in the best light possible. It really establishes your relevance in the market and your relevance in the community and your credibility. Because ultimately, if somebody came to you and they wanted a $10,000 loan, you're going to be looking at their credibility. You're going to want to know, can you prove to me that you can spend my money that I'm loaning to you properly? And you're going to expect that person to give you all these reasons why. All of the things they've done in the past, they've accepted loans, they've paid them back, and you want them to be credible, and so does a funder. So in this section, you want to really put yourself forward as being reliable and trustworthy. This section provides the background for how and why you started your organization or your business. We are all passionate about what we do, whether you're in the nonprofit sector or business sector. We didn't get into this business for no reason. We're here because we had goals, we had a mission and a vision. And this is when you can talk a little bit about that. And this is where personal stories come in. Funders are people, and they're very interested in personal stories. So you can talk about, how and why you started your business, what you were hoping to achieve. Make it a little personal here, not too personal, but a little bit. Give them something to kind of sink their teeth into. In this section, this is where you may be asked to include what's called a mission statement. And some businesses may have a mission statement, some may not. In the nonprofit field, every nonprofit organization has a mission statement. And it's basically a statement about what you do and why you do it. Sometimes it can be a sentence, sometimes it's a paragraph. If you don't have a mission statement, this is the first time maybe you're hearing about this term, it's basically your company's primary aim. It's why you're in business, what you do, why you do it. This section will explain major steps in your development. Now, this wouldn't be, every single thing that you did. First I bought a building, and then I hired staff, and then I did this, and then I did that. They're really just looking for major achievements, accomplishments of growth. When you started, when you really launched something big, when you hit a big achievement or a big milestone in your goals. Those are the things you want to talk about here. And ultimately, it describes your vision for change or your goal for your product or service. And this is kind of the bigger picture of what you're trying to do with your business. And this section, this is a lot of stuff. So the things that I just talked about, it's a lot. This section sometimes takes quite a while. The good thing is once you've written this and once you've really, fine-tuned it and really honed it, you can typically use this for most proposals. So this might take a little bit of time. Also in this section, you can explain any awards or recognitions that you've received. And this is a good thing because, again, establishes your credibility. Okay, so next section. Most of the time you're going to be asked to provide some kind of overview of your programs or your services, your sales, your products. This is when they want to know a little bit more about what you do and how you do it. And this is done in an overview. So sometimes, we're doing a lot, we're accomplishing a lot, and we want to say all of it. But if you can kind of compress the explanation about what you do, that is helpful because we don't want it to be a book of every little single thing that we do, right? Because nobody's going to read that book. So sometimes as you're writing this section, you might write many, many, many pages and find yourself having to edit it down. So this is a brief overview of each program or element or piece of your work or your product or your service. Overview being keyword there. It includes information on what you have accomplished through these programs, sales, or with your products. So we're always focused on letting them know what we are doing in our work and how it's been successful. Again, credibility. It explains the basic of the 5 W's, the who, what, when, why, and where. And so as you're writing this piece, the time that you want to go back and you want to review it and start editing, ask yourself, have I explained the 5 W's? All of the elements of your programs and your services and your products. Have I explained enough? Have I covered all of the bases here? The who, the what, the when, the why, and the where. Now, spotlight the elements of what you do that the funder is really interested in. So some of us may have businesses that offer a lot. And rather than have that laundry list that you're talking about, maybe really sort of compressed discussion of the elements that the funder is really not relevant to the funder, and spotlight and talk more about the programs or the products that that particular funder is going to want to know about. Again, you're giving them what they want, not necessarily what is the most important thing to you. Getting back to that main point. Carefully organize this section to make it easy to read. So oftentimes I use bullets, I use numbering or lettering. I really like bullets because I think just visually it's just a lot easier to bullet. Sometimes like bolding keywords to call attention to those words is a good thing to do. Make sure it's sort of easy to grasp, because anytime you're talking about a lot of different things all in one paragraph, it can be too much. And your reviewer may have like 20 minutes to look at your proposal or 5 minutes to look at your proposal. We want to make it easy for them to do that. So really organize this well. Okay, now this is an area of proposals that you may see or you may not see. In the nonprofit sector, you almost always have to write a need or a problem statement. Need statement, problem statement, some variation of those terms. And this is when you have to explain what gap you are filling, what need you are addressing. And oftentimes we have to substantiate that need. So it explains this problem that you're addressing or why your product is crucial and needed. So how do we substantiate this need? Because anybody could say, this is a problem, this is a need, the market needs this, people need this. Anybody can say that, right? Anytime you can point to some data or surveys, maybe some research that's been done or industry statistics, if you can incorporate a little bit of that just to substantiate that this need really does exist, that's really helpful. Sometimes that can educate the funder about the issue that you're working on or the issue that you're addressing in your business. Sometimes they might not actually know very much about this need. We don't want to go too far with statistics and data because, you know, when people talk statistics to you, you might remember 1 or 2 things. You're not going to remember 10. So really find just key pieces of information, key data, statistics, research points, just enough to substantiate that need, not too much. It also identifies the people or the things that are affected by this issue, because ultimately what we do affects people. So really identify who those people are, what groups they might be part of. We want to connect the need and the people, because funders want to help people. Funders want to achieve goals. And so when we can kind of connect them to the needs of individual people, that really is a human interest piece that will I think, make them more interested in reading our proposal. But it's not a sob story, right? And so this is a fine line when you're talking about, so especially if your business is something that involves meeting a really, really disastrous or difficult need, or your product is being created for people who are really suffering in some way. We don't want to make it too much of a sob story. We don't want to get lost in this need. What we want to do is we want to explain it, but then come back out of it quickly so that we can explain to them how we are going to be the solution here. And I see this mistake with nonprofits a lot. Sometimes they'll go on and on and on. And sometimes they're dealing with heart-wrenching issues, and that is very real and valid, but we don't want to spend too much time on that. Now, say data is not available for this piece, you can point to other sources, anything to sort of substantiate your claims in this section. Okay. Target population. So your target population could be your market, the people who are buying your product or using your service, or people who are benefiting from it. That's called your target population. People or groups to be impacted by your program or your business, and knowing as much as possible about the people or the areas or the groups or the markets that you're in is really key. Really understanding them and knowing information about them is critical here. So it describes the demographics of the people that you are selling to or involving in some way. The community, it could be a country that you are in business in, or it could be a small community. It could be several people. It's describing who these people are, where they live, what they're about. And it also explains how this group in particular is affected by the problem that you just presented in the section just prior. So it's connecting those two. Okay, so now this is the central component of your grant proposal. And this is the area where you really want to take probably the most time to develop it. Because funders will kind of read quickly through those sections that I just talked about. They're important, but they're not going to spend too much time in those sections. This is the area and the text that they're going to be reading and really digesting. So funders have all their own language, and it is important to know what they mean when they use certain words. Sometimes they call this section the narrative. Sometimes they call it the approach or your approach. Sometimes they'll call this a description, a business description, a project description. Those are the terms that you might see sort of thrown out and about. It's the meat and the potatoes of your application, and it is closely read, as I just noted. It explains how you plan to address a need or a gap in service. And so if you did a good job in the prior sections, it's going to be very easy to connect that with what you're doing right now with your proposed project or plan. So it identifies high-level goals and objectives that are designed to meet the goals. Now, we see these words, goals and objectives, and it took me a long time as a grant writer to actually really understand what those words mean. And so again, understanding the terminology is really important, because then you're going to be giving them the right information that they want to read. So a goal is sort of what you are trying to accomplish, right? It's a very high level thing. Oftentimes your business could have one goal. You could have multiple goals. It really depends on what your business is all about. Those are sort of the high end aims of what you're doing, and your objectives are sort of your plans. So like think about it in terms of a to-do list, right? If you're building a house, right, your high level goal is going to be building the house. That's the big thing you're focusing your attention on. And your objectives are all of the big steps that you're going to take in order to get that house built. Find a contractor, get your supplies, craft your budget. These are all the things that you need to do when you are building a house. So your objectives is sort of like your plans, and your high level goal is the overall thing that you are trying to accomplish. This section provides evidence why you are likely to succeed, because especially if we have really high level goals and really, meaty, like really intensive objectives, a funder may look at that and say, how do we know that you are going to be successful with this? Like, how do we know this is the right approach? How do we know that this won't, if you undertake this plan, that you won't wind up accomplishing something very different than what you think you're going to accomplish? So try to build in some evidence of why you're likely to succeed. So that could be explaining how other business owners have used this approach and it's worked for them. or research shows that this type of product has been very successful in accomplishing this goal that you've set for yourself. So anytime you can draw in other success stories, it's going to help convince the funder that your approach is really the right one. It links to what are called best practices or other successful ventures when possible. Now, a best practice is a pursuit or a plan or an approach that has been tested and used by many different entities, businesses, nonprofits, and it's come to be known as sort of like an industry standard. So anytime that you can call attention to a best practice, then you are going to be more likely to be seen as credible, because as a business owner, you're out there, you're looking around to see what other people are doing in your area, right? You've got your eyes on other similar businesses. You want to know where they're at and what they're doing. Being aware of your community and what is working in your community, super helpful. Okay, so I covered a lot in that section. So how do you pull this all together? Like how can this all flow? You can start with just a sentence or two about your project's purpose and your overview statement. Just a brief, quick sentence. Sometimes I'll actually use the word overview followed by a colon, and then I'll write one or two sentences. And that just sort of sets up the reader to know what you're going to talk about. Then you can include a paragraph that identifies your goals, your high-level project purposes. If you have a couple goals, you could bullet them. You could use numbers. Separating them out, I think, is really helpful because it helps the reader to kind of grasp when you have one goal versus two versus three. And sometimes when we write and sometimes when we talk, we just kind of group everything together. It's like one big run-on sentence. And so when you separate out really important pieces like goals and objectives, bullets work really, really well there. Then in your next paragraph, you can state your objectives. And these are the main tasks that you are going to take to accomplish your goals. Again, bullets are great. And you want to sort of lay this out so that if somebody is reading your objectives, reading these sort of main steps or main activities that you're going to take, that they can be convinced that if you do all those things, that you're going to achieve your goal. Then after that, then you can start talking about what I call the minutia. And very often, because of what we do, we are involved in minutia every day. We have to find somebody to take out our trash. We have got to find an accountant. We have to deal with this problem or that problem, right? So that's like our to-do list is very, very long. So in this section, you want to talk about some of the smaller steps that you know you're going to have to take. And it can be sometimes tough to decide, okay, what steps do I talk about? Because you don't want to have this really, really, really long project description that goes on and on about everything. You know, you're going to do this on Monday, then you're going to do this on Tuesday. Just identify some of those key steps, things you have to accomplish in order to move forward with your project. In the next section, you can name, any collaborators, any business partners, how they're going to be involved, what their roles will be. You might not have to do, if you have no business partners, you don't have to do this section. It would be good to spell that out there. And then you can explain staffing and specific expertise. So in your project description, we want to convince the funder that you as a business owner or you as a project manager know your stuff. And this is especially important if you are an entrepreneur and this is your baby. This is something you founded and you're building it, and you are the person behind that company. This is the section where you want to name yourself and you want to talk a little bit about yourself and establishing why you have the right experience and expertise to lead this effort. And think about who you might want to include in that section. You don't want to name all your staff. You don't have to name everybody who's doing anything in your business, just some key people. and maybe a sentence or two about what their credentials are, education, and experience. Let me see if there's, I think there might be one more thing here. No, so I'm going to go back. So this is a great way to set up this section. And as you're writing, what might help, and this is just sort of like a tip from me, the way that I tend to do things is I like to have sections where I will dump information. So in this section, you might want to even create for yourself headers, project purpose, goals, objectives. And then as you write, organize your information within those sections. And then from there, you can sort of group it all together and make sure that it all flows. I think it's easier to work like that than to sit down and start with your project purpose and then just write on and on and on and on and on. Sometimes our brains can't handle all of that. So taking it in little pieces and grouping it together at the end will probably make this section read better. Program evaluation. Now, this may not pertain to your proposal. This is something that almost always nonprofits are asked for, and sometimes businesses will be asked for this as well. This is a component of an application that a lot of times people get stumped on because we do what we do, but we don't often think about evaluating how we're successful. Now, some of us may do this because some of us are sort of evidence-based, real practical people, and we think things through, we maintain our data, we go back, we run our numbers. Some of us are just more into that part of our work, but others don't really think like that, right? And so our program evaluation is when we ask ourselves, how do we know that what we're doing is working? And if it's not working, what do we do? And this gives our funders some confidence that we are actually thinking critically about how we're doing what we're doing, that we're not just operating and without any attention to effectiveness. So this is your plan to assess the extent to which you're reaching your program or your business goals. It describes your outcomes. So I'm going to throw out a couple of terms here. Understanding what these terms mean, important. Just try to grasp this because sometimes these terms, they don't really make a lot of sense the first time you see them. So trying to get too overwhelmed with them. I'm just going to give you a little overview, and then when you start grant writing, that's when you can start really diving in and grasping them a little bit more. But program evaluation, it describes your outcomes. And outcomes are things that have changed or things that are results. So an outcome could be developing a specific product. An outcome could be launching a new aspect to your business. These are the results of your work. These are things that are different because of what you do. Those are called outcomes. And sometimes a funder will say, tell us what your outcomes are. And so it's basically a code word for results. In this section, it really helps if you can describe how you're going to analyze what is working in your business, what is not working, and what should be changed. And so asking ourselves, and sometimes the grant writing process can be really helpful because it can show ourselves another lens or another view into what we do. It can help us actually be really good critiquers of our own work. And so in this section, you're going to be explaining how are you going to analyze if what you're doing is working. And if it isn't, if it is, great, but if it isn't, how are you going to adapt and change? And so those are going to lead to questions like, well, wait a minute, all right, what am I going to do if what I'm doing is not successful? And so you might have to really think about this section before you start writing. Your program evaluation is going to explain how you're going to track your data. And data could be anything and everything. Data is numbers and figures. And hopefully as you go along in your business, you're really thinking about tracking everything that you do. And especially if you want to write a lot of proposals, funders love to hear about data. You know, how many things you've sold, how many people you've employed, all the different, types of products that you might have created or they love data. They love the numbers and the explicit details of the scope of what you're doing. So if you can consider how you might be able to track those numbers as you go along, this piece will be a lot easier to do. Now, some of us might not be tracking anything, and this would be a good time to start thinking about how you might do that. In this section, you're going to talk about your data sources. Now, this may have nothing to do with you as a business, but sometimes you might see a funder say, we would like you to develop surveys for your customers, or questionnaires, or do what's called pre-testing or post-testing. What this all means is these are sort of concrete ways of getting feedback from people on what you're doing. You may not have to do this, but it may be a good thing to just kind of keep your mind on, like, how can I survey people? Do I do focus groups? Do I ever ask for feedback from my customers? If you can find ways to gather that feedback, that could be super useful when writing grants. It is so great to be able to say, we did a survey of 100 clients and 90% told us that my service has helped them to grow in some way. You have something precise that you're not actually just creating out of nowhere, right? You actually have real data that you can share with the funder. Program evaluation really speaks to accountability. It's going to hold you accountable to what you say that you're doing. Anytime that you set some metrics for yourself, some benchmarks for yourself, now all of a sudden, you have to go back and you have to analyze that. And so more and more over time, over the last 2 decades that I've been writing grants, I've been seeing that many funders are focusing a lot on program evaluation because it holds grantees accountable to what they say they're going to do. All right, here's a couple more terms that I'm going to throw at you. Again, trying to get overwhelmed about them, but you may see these pop up. So outcomes, we talked about that one. What will be different as the result of this work or product? Those are your results. If you hear this word indicators, right? Indicators speaks to indication. How do we know that we have achieved these results or these outcomes? These would be our indicators. This is information, or this is data that can show, that can demonstrate that you have achieved your result. And that's called an indicator. Measurement tools. These are the tools that we use to evaluate our progress. Measurement tools could be anything from keeping records of sales that we make or services that we deliver. Measurement tools could be some sort of metric that we develop to sort of rate the things that we're doing. There's all sorts of measurement tools that we could be using. But basically, if you hear that term, that means the tools that you're using to evaluate your progress. And deliverables. Funders love deliverables. Funders is the evidence, the records that you're keeping, and it provides the evidence that you are doing what you say that you would do. These are called deliverables. Very often they're records, that it's actual paper, or it's data, or it's something in your computer that you can pull out and show as evidence that you accomplished this work. So those are some terms there. And then in our last section here, we're talking about reporting, and reporting is always the thing after the fact. The grant comes in, you're celebrating, you have your champagne, and then you start spending the money and you get started. And sometimes we forget that we have to go back and tell the funder what we did with their money. And so reporting, remembering that you have a report is a big thing. And also knowing what you have to report on is critical, because then as you move through your project period, you know what you have to keep track of. Because if you know you have to share a whole bunch of figures, and it could be sales figures, or it could be, product figures. If you know you have to provide that at the end of the project period, you want to create a mechanism for yourself to be able to gather that. The worst thing is sitting down to write a report and realizing, oh no, I never even tracked the things that they told me I had to track. And then you're really kind of stuck. So understand beforehand the reports that are going to be required of you. They could be narrative, they could be just explanatory. You could have to just write a paragraph. It could be financial reporting. Maybe they want to know exactly how you spent the money. They may want to see spreadsheets. They may want to see financial documents, or it could be a combination of both. Reporting might also involve some multimedia, some social media, and other non-written deliverables. Anytime that you can demonstrate really positive media about what you're doing is great. Now, sometimes you won't have the opportunity to provide that, but if you can, like any articles that have been written about you, maybe you've done some social media work or videos, those are great to showcase to funders, because it's so much more interesting watching a video than reading this long, boring report. Now, if you don't file your reports, there are repercussions, particularly with the federal government. They're becoming really, really strict on this. If you have to submit a report and you never do, sometimes you'll be put on a blacklist and they will not fund you again. So sort of a little bit of scaring there, and make sure that you do your reports. Let's talk a little bit about budgeting. We're not going to go into this in too much detail, and many of us have our financial people that we can turn to help with things like budgeting, thank God. Now, if you are a one-woman or one-man show, this might fall on you. So we're going to talk a little bit about budgeting for business, and I'll throw in a couple of things about nonprofits there, because budgeting is very different for a business entity versus a nonprofit. So if you are for-profit, which probably most of you are, you might not even need to submit any type of budget or financials. The funder may not even ask for it. They may just give you a cash award and say, go in peace, go do your work. They may not expect you to spend that money in a certain way. If you're nonprofit, very often they want to know how you're spending the money, sometimes in a really, really detailed way. And so when you develop a budget for a nonprofit project, you're showing sort of a balance between all of the money that you're bringing in for this project and all of the money that you're going to be spending. So a nonprofit, you're expected not to have extra money at the end of the year. You are expected to spend what you earn. And now as a business, it's different. If you have a profit, that's ideal, that's great. And so funders know that. So that's a big difference between for-profit and nonprofit budgeting. If you are required to do a budget, check it and do the reasonability test, right? Is this a reasonable plan for funding all of the expenses involved in running your business or your program? Because sometimes we start running numbers, and especially if we are planning to use money on something that we've never done before, we're going to do something new, we have all these new expenses, it can seem like a wish list. After you've developed your budget and you've described how you're going to spend your money, go back and just look at it. Ask yourself, is this reasonable? If another person looked at this budget, are they going to say, wait a minute, these expenses are way out of line. It should not cost you this much to hire a contractor, or you should not be spending that much money on an accountant. Give it an eyeball. Is this reasonable? And then for nonprofits, sometimes you have to explain how you're making money. So when you have a business, it's assumed that you have clients or people are buying your stuff. And so money's coming in that way. With nonprofits, it's not so easy. Sometimes you are selling things or you're providing service, but very often you're out there hawking for grants and charitable money. And so Sometimes you may have to describe where you're getting your money from. You might have to give very precise figures, and sometimes you won't. And sometimes, like I mentioned, with nonprofits, funders want to see that all the money you're bringing in is all the money that you're spending. We shouldn't have these big profits at the end of the year with a nonprofit organization. Now, if you're running a very specific program, they may want to see all of the expenses involved in just that program. Now, this can kind of be challenging for businesses that are growing because we often may not track that. We may not track sort of supplies costs for one activity versus another. We might just know how much we're spending for supplies for our entire business. But when you start writing grants, sometimes you may be asked to sort of tease out, okay, which expenses are just related to the program for which you're seeking money? And it's sort of a new way to look at spending. And this is where your accountant really comes in handy because they know how to track all this stuff. If you hear that term operating budget, very often a funder will say, send us your operating budget. And that is sort of an overview of all the expenses of your organization, everything that you spend your money on. So an operating budget's different from a program budget because an operating is all the expenses. A program budget is just specific expenses used in one program or activity. So those are two terms that are definitely good to know for budgeting. And sometimes even for for-profits as well, having a diversity of funding is important because that means if one funding stream were to dry up for one reason or another, you're not going to go under. So really showing that you have a lot of different possibilities for income can show the funder that, okay, you're going to be viable. You're probably more likely to be viable than if you're just relying on one income source, because what happens if that income source dries up? Where are you, right? So showing a diversity of funding can put you in sort of a more credible and a more viable light. And in terms of a budget format, it's sort of like, if you had your home budget, you might have a list of all of your income sources, your wages, your earnings, your child support, however you're earning your income, right? And then you're tracking your expenses. And these are all different types of expenses, all the things that you might be spending your money on at home. You've got your rent, your mortgage, utilities, food, insurance, all that stuff. When you create a budget for a funder, it's sort of along those same lines. You have a section for all your income and where you're getting your money from and how much, and then a list of all of your expenses. And try to get as specific as you can, but if you find your expenses are like really diverse and it's a long list, you might want to do some grouping so that you don't have so many numbers for a funder to have to look at. After you've done all of that, sort of the tail end of the proposal, the last piece is some supplementary documents that you might be asked for. And sometimes you're asked for them and sometimes you're not. I'm just going to run through a list of certain things that you may come across. If you're tax exempt, 501c3 letter. You're probably not going to have to do that, but that's a letter from the IRS saying that you are tax exempt. Nonprofits almost always have to provide that. You might have to provide a list of your board of directors if you have a board, or they might ask for a chart of your ownership structure. Who owns your business? Who are the major players in your business? You might have to provide, any legal agreements that you've entered into, a list of any charitable contributors, maybe other grant funders or investors. They might want to see a list of that. You could be asked to provide financial statements or bank statements, any certificates or licenses that you need to operate. They might want to know that you have those already in hand. They might want to see a copy of that. Nonprofits oftentimes have to submit what's called a 990 And that's the nonprofit version of a tax return. And for businesses, they might also ask to see your tax returns too. And sometimes they'll ask for, materials specific to your program, your organization, your business, resumes for key people. They might ask for that. Sometimes they'll ask for a W-9, which establishes your eligibility to actually receive funds from the funder. Oh, let me go back. They may ask you for other things, but these are some of the typical ones that'll pop up. Note, make sure that you send them what they want. So if they ask for these things, always be sure to provide them. If you can't provide them, you can write a note, and instead of showing them, financial statements, instead you could just upload to their grant system just a note saying, we're not providing this and these are the reasons why. If you can't provide something, don't just leave it out, because they may wonder, like, where is it? And if they don't see that document, they may just throw out your proposal. So if you can't provide something, explain why. And some final tips. And let's see, we are right at 5:16. So this is great. 4:16 your time. I'm on the East Coast here. Some final tips: review, revise, review, and revise. The more time that you can do, editing, polishing, the better your proposal is going to be. Have an outsider read and comment on your work. This could be a blow to the ego, but really try to do that. At least have one person read your stuff. Stay on top of your deadlines. I don't know how many grants have fallen through because they thought it was due Tuesday. Turns out it was due Monday. Put them on your calendar, track them, make sure you're on top of them. Tip: don't submit the day of the deadline. If it's due on Tuesday, really try to get it in by Monday, because sometimes these systems that funders use, they're overwhelmed and they crash. Or it turns out you can't get your username to work to get into their system, or you need to print something out and your printer's down and you run out of time. I mean, there's so many things that can get in the way. Try to plan to submit at least a day in advance. Keep copies of your proposals accessible to you. Really, really important, because you may want to use those to write other grant proposals, but you also may need to go back to it if you have to write a report. You're going to want to see, oh, what did I write about? You're going to want to refresh yourself, right? So keep those on hand. If you've received an award or some form of contribution or grant, it's always good to think about recognizing that. Sometimes funders care about that. Sometimes they want the community to know what they're doing, and other times they don't. And here are some resources. And I'm going to make this presentation available. So you could do a quick screenshot right now if you want, but then this will be available to you later. So let's take our last few minutes here before we get to questions. I'm just going to go through this a sample RFP, because this is an RFP that I believe is still open for the Jane Walker Awards. Okay, that popped up. Looks like I'm still screen sharing. Okay. So this is an RFP, the Jane Walker First Women Grant Program. Breaking boundaries. Okay, there you go. You know something already about the funder. They're looking to break boundaries. All right, let's read on. So usually an RFP will sort of start out with a little bit of history and overview, and that's what they do here. Jane Walker, I Fund Women. They're talking about the connection with Johnnie Walker, which is a whiskey. And this program celebrates the achievements of women and all of those pushing boundaries towards gender equality. And that program wants to see more firsts for women. So already you can look at that first statement and kind of figure out, does this apply to me? If it doesn't apply to you, you can move on. If it does apply to you and you sort of think like, oh, okay, this is along the lines of what I'm doing in my business, then you can read on. And it looks like here they talk about some of the history, and they talk about first, they talk about women who are doing amazing things and big accomplishments. Let's see. Okay, so here is the explanation about how they get started. As part of the First Women campaign, Jane Walker and I Fund Women have teamed up to help create more opportunities for women to achieve their goals. They'll be funding 30 groundbreaking women-owned businesses through the end of the year. Businesses will be selected, and these are the industries. You're going to receive a $10,000 grant plus a 1-year annual coaching membership. All right, good. That provides a lot of information. You're going to know, okay, do I fit in here? Am I part of one of these industries? Is $10,000 too little? Is it not worth it? So you're going to be asking yourself questions. And down here, if you remember in the beginning, I said, try to find out who these funders have given money to. Here you go. These are some of the people that have received money from Jane Walker. Okay, let's read about them. And as you look through this section, ask yourself if you sort of see yourself here. Do you think that if your bio was here, that people would see that you're part of this crowd, right? If you see people who are spotlighted or businesses that are spotlighted that are not like yours, well, you're probably not going to be funded. So this is a great thing. They're showing you who they've already funded. So this is a really, really helpful. A lot of funders don't tell you who they've given money to. All right. And then there's one more page here that I'm going to click over to. Okay. Here is when they start talking about the criteria. Are you eligible? You have to be in the US. You have to have certain revenue. You have to have certain history, have a product, a service in a certain industry. So these are all the eligibility criteria. Read this carefully, really read this carefully. Applicants have to be 21 or older. See, that could rule you out. If you don't scroll all the way down and you're 18, then your proposal could be ruled out. So hot tip, within this application, you'll be asked to provide imagery and a video that demonstrates how your business is breaking boundaries. Oh, that's an interesting one. Do you have a video? Can you create a video? You might not be able to do it. So read this through a couple of times. If this sounds like, okay, this is me, then you can get started and go through the application. And my last tip here before I stop is get a sense of the application before you start writing. And sometimes these systems they'll make you give them information before they move you through. And sometimes it's good to try to move through and see what they're asking, because if it turns out they've got 50 questions for you, you might want to abandon the plan. Okay, that was a really quick overview, but those are the things to be looking for. Now, if you don't find all the information you need here, you might need to do a little Googling, find out more about the program, or what is Johnny Walker? Why does Johnny Walker even care about this? You could do a little Googling to get some background info. All right, so that was a lot. I hope that was helpful. I'm going to stop screen sharing. And I'm going to turn on my camera.
And we do have some questions, and I do want to let people know that that is an active grant, and it is opened until June of this year. So like Suzanne said, look at it and see if you qualify for it, and and go for it. And I did want to, and when I found that one, because they had another one, but it closed before our session. So we have that one. So definitely, take a look and see if it applies to you. So Suzanne, I'm gonna tell you a couple of questions that we have. Okay, so let's see. There's one question about sending conceptual letters to foundations. And so can you speak to that? Because is that something that you would just randomly do, or do you do that when when they have a project or opportunity available?
Great question. There are some grant writers that think that's a good idea. Personally, my own opinion, is a waste of time. People who work at foundations get inundated with stuff. So if they don't tell you, if you're going on their website and they don't say, send your concept or letter of intent here, if they don't mention anything about it, it's because they're not soliciting them. So really only send them something if they're interested in receiving it. That's just my advice. Now, the only exception to that, if you know somebody who works there, you have a connection, that might be a reason for you to reach out and to try to promote yourself. Otherwise, I don't think it's really worthwhile. Hope that helps.
Okay. The other question was, where would you find the funder's mission? But I think you just gave an example of that with the Johnny Walker. So yeah, so she gave an example of that in the Johnny Walker. Another question is, what's a typical rate for a grant writer?
Oh, good question. It's all across the board. Sometimes grant writers, if they're less experienced, they might charge, say, 20, 25 bucks an hour. I know some people who charge $200 an hour. It really depends on what sort of expertise you need. I would say you really want to look around and talk to different grant writers, get a sense of what they're charging, and then also really think about experience, because you may want to not pay somebody a lot, but remember, if you pay somebody a little bit amount of money, you may get a little bit of quality. So try to do a little bit of research and ask for proposals. If you're a person saying I'm charging $100 an hour and you're like, ooh, that's kind of a lot, ask them to share a proposal, check it out, see if it's really good, because you might get something and say, oh, this is not really worth it to pay somebody $100. But it really is all across the board. I would say, you guys are in Chicago, so the rates might be higher than out here. I would say anywhere from 20, 25 up to, like, I'd say 100. Not too many go over $100 an hour.
Here's a question. It says, as an NGO looking for funding, do I have to meet all the parameters set in the grant writing proposals?
So an NGO, a non-governmental organization, so that would be like a nonprofit. Yes, I mean, anytime, doesn't matter what type of entity you are, you will have to meet all of the criteria. It's rare that a funder will just give money to an organization that is outside of their interests or the eligibility. I hope that answered the question.
The one thing that people ask, did you have an example of a well-written proposal?
Me personally?
Yeah, so like, do you have an example of a well-written proposal, or maybe one that was written and it was accepted? So do you have any kind of example? So if you do, if you can send that to me, if you have something, then I can include it with the deck if you have something.
Yes, I do. One thing to note is that when you write proposals for organizations, they really do expect that you keep that in-house. So okay. I do have some from a while back for organizations that are no longer around. I'm very concerned about confidentiality. Anytime I work with somebody, I want to make sure that your stuff is private. So people may not have a lot to show you as a grant writer, and that might be actually a good sign that they're going to keep your stuff confidential.
Okay. So I think here that people will just have to follow the guidelines that she gave you in terms of the description, the details, being able to have your budget. So that's what you'll have to follow in terms of your examples. Someone asked, is it a federal grant or can PTCAs help? No, it's okay. Wait a minute. If it's a federal grant, can our PTACs help?
What is a PTAC? I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar with that either. Maybe Elisa will reply back to that. Are there grant writing softwares?
Oh, good question. I don't know of one that's out there. If they did develop one, I probably wouldn't use it, because really, to write grants, you really have to know how to talk about what you do. And a computer program is going to find it really hard. It's going to be hard for it to help you with that. I think a better way to go is to develop a template. And there are resources online that can show you like sample templates and maybe some sample language of like what you might include in that section. Those might be helpful, but as for software, I'd sort of be leery of that.
Okay, so the PTAC is a procurement technical assistance?
I'm not really sure what that is. But anytime you have a question about whether or not a funder will accept something, or if you're not sure if you're eligible, you can always reach out. Usually in an RFP, they'll specify a person or an email address or an office that to which you can direct questions. And that's another reason why you want to you want to be thinking about grants well in advance, because say you have a question, you want to give them time to answer it. So whoever asked that question, you might be able to direct that question to a government agency, and the RFP will direct you to someone, or at least an office.
Let's see. Lisa, you had a question. Can you put your question in chat, Lisa, if you're still on? Because I saw you had your hand raised, but I don't see where you put your question in the chat. Okay. And someone asked, what is the RFQ?
Do you mean an RFP, a request for proposal?
Yeah, maybe they, okay, because I'm thinking maybe that's what they meant, RFP. They put RFQ.
Yeah, and so that's basically instructions, just instructions of how to apply, what to submit with your proposal. It's sort of everything that you need to do to get money.
Okay.
A request for qualification. I saw that pop up. Yeah, you know, if you're ever confused about acronyms, because they're all, funders are coming up with new things every day, Google them to make sure you understand exactly what that term means, what that acronym is. Don't try not to guess too much. Really, you'll be able to find out by Googling. So it looks like someone knew the answer to that. RFQ is require for quote. Okay, so we see a couple of different explanations about what that might mean. So yeah, find out what it means first, and Google will help you with that.
Okay, and I think that covers all of the questions. I do believe. So for everyone who is here, if you are interested in receiving the slides, just send an email to the email address where you receive the invite to this session, and you can receive today's presentation. I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank Suzanne. Someone asked, could you recommend qualified grant writers? Well, she's a qualified grant writer. So Suzanne, why don't you put your information up if people want to contact you?
Sure.
If people want to contact you.
Yep. So let me just share my screen for one more moment. I can leave this up. If I can move that. There you go. If you can see that, thank you and good luck. And there's my email address. And again, my name is Suzanne Alden. Grant Expect, that's a CT, not Grant Expert, but grantexpect@gmail.com.
So you can contact Suzanne if you're interested in reaching out to her to help you with writing a grant. And like I said, once again, if you're interested in receiving the slides from today, send an email to the email address where you receive. All right, I'm cut off. And just request the slides. And then also we'll be sending out a survey. So please complete the survey. That allows us to know, gives us feedback on the session and what kind of sessions we should have in the future. And the next thing we have coming up for the 27th and 29th is on trademarking. So day one will be the basics of trademarking, and then day two on the second session, she'll go into more detail about trademarking. So thank you everyone for attending. Night. If you received the invitation to this session, that's the email that you should reply.
Oops, it looks like we lost some audio there. Devry? Okay, maybe the session is ended. If anyone